Daniel, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you here with us today and ask if you want to have just a few opening comments.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me back. This is my second constitutional chat. I think last one was last year, and I was very happy to come and always answer the questions from the students about, what makes us special in America and why we need to protect this country and how do we preserve our freedoms. And by doing that, comparing it with the rest of the world. And so I think I have a very important experience to discuss today, because what happened in Venezuela is a warning for us, because Venezuela is the only socialist nation that became that way, not through an invasion, not through a revolution or civil war. It was through a democratic election and a changing and a destruction of our original constitution. Venezuela used to be a democracy since the late 50s until 1999, when Hugo Chavez assumed power. And when that happened, the first thing he did after winning an election democratically was to begin the process of rewriting the constitution. The Venezuelan constitution was ratified, the previous one in 1961. The current one was ratified as soon after, about a year after Chavez assumed power in 1999. What happened was that he knew that a constitution, like in most places, is intended to limit the power of government. And Hugo Chavez knew that. He knew that he could not become a tyrant if the Venezuelan constitution didn't change, and if the population and the justice system and every one of the branches of government, judicial, legislative, and executive, were fully under his control, as well as eliminating the power of municipalities and states. And so what he did was to first pack the Supreme Court of Venezuela, which allowed him to amend the constitution under a process that did not exist before. Like in the United States, to amend the Constitution, you needed, a large number of Congress, not just a simple majority, but a qualified majority, usually 2/3. And then you needed, a referendum in Venezuela, and you needed to do it only article by article, each one of them separately. It was not easy to amend the Constitution. What Chavez did was that he knew that was not enough. He couldn't just amend one article. He couldn't do it one by one. It would have taken him decades. His term would expire by then, so he wouldn't be able to stay in power. And so what he did was he named new Supreme Court justices that interpreted the Constitution to his liking. After that, he told them that because the Constitution was supposed to represent the people, then the people could simply vote for a new constitution. And if 51% of the population believes we can completely change our system of government, then that's okay. And that's exactly what happened. They allowed him to do that. There was a referendum in which the majority of the population voted to rewrite the constitution. And then they voted for new people to write it. He had a large majority in the assembly to rewrite the constitution. And he wrote a constitution to his liking. Before, we did not have re-election. The presidential term was 5 years. After the new constitution, it was 6-year term with re-election, which he ultimately amended to not just having one period, but unlimited re-elections of 6-year terms. He diminished the power of the states. He diminished the power of the judiciary. He diminished the power of the legislative, abolishing the Senate, and just having a House of Representatives that they could change its election method as much as they wanted to. So basically, they eliminated all the safeguards that we had. After packing the judicial branch, not only did they interpret the Constitution to their liking, even the one that they themselves wrote, which they didn't even follow. What they also did was that they stopped enforcing the actual laws that matter, especially regarding crime. So even if police officers would catch a criminal in Venezuela, judges would never convict, or they would never take up cases, or people would be free, even without parole. And the consequence was that when Chavez took office, since Chavez took office, crime more than doubled, tripled. Now Caracas is one of the most dangerous cities in the world by homicide rate. And this is product of that breakdown of powers and that breakdown of our constitution. So we have been living in a lawless country for 24 years now. And that's the sad part about Venezuela. The sad part was that most of the population initially voted for this. They don't support that anymore, for sure. Most of the people alive today were not even 18 years old by the time when in 1999 in Venezuela. A quarter of the population has left the country, so they're not even living there anymore. I'm one of them, and so this is why our decisions today matter for the future, because today Venezuelans, even though previous generations voted in these people, current generations cannot vote them out because now the elections are rigged. Now they control the elections, they control the judges, they control the parliament, they control the bureaucracy, absolutely everything. When I tell you they control it, I don't just mean they just appoint the people. I mean, like, even if you go into any government office, say the equivalent of the IRS, or even local government offices, schools, you would see written on the walls of the buildings phrases like, here you can't speak bad about Chavez, you can speak ill about Chavez, you can say anything that criticizes them. That's what it's written on the walls of government offices, a clear, statement that violates freedom of speech, right? I mean, I can say whatever I want about the president. I should be able to do it. Not in Venezuela. And so it's the complete takeover of our laws. And that's why the US Constitution is so important, but at the same time, so fragile. Because if you look at the US Constitution, what do you see? Sure, it's a very difficult amendment process, but something the founders did not, I think, and this is my personal opinion, but we can discuss this in the Q&A. They did not discuss the possibility that the president and a majority of Congress could simply appoint 10 new Supreme Court justices, and then they could interpret the Constitution to their liking. That can happen today. And what stops that from happening? Right now, it's just because we haven't elected people willing to go through with that plan. But if that happens ever, we are not immune to the same path of Venezuela. And this is why we need to be careful, not just in elections, but we also need to be mindful of the vulnerabilities of our system so that we don't commit the same mistakes. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm very happy to talk about economics, why socialism and how socialism destroyed Venezuela, specifics about the laws, about the Constitution, and about the US in general.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview and really interesting about the Venezuela Constitution. I'm going to go to Janine, and I know, Janine, you've got some great questions, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that overture there. Kind of frightening, but really interesting, Daniel, that we always think of a takeover of a country being militaristic. Or we worry now that it's going to be artificial intelligence or aliens, which from another planet. But it's pretty frightening when you talk about the fact that it can be. Well, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise, really. We've seen charismatic leaders come forward and have an impact over populations in many places. But what was Hugo Chavez saying to the people at that time? And let's go back and describe. So before Chavez, I'm assuming you were capitalist society and democracy and things of that nature. And then when Chavez came in, what was he saying, and what was the slow sort of coercion of the 51% of the people that were able to believe what he was saying? Because leaders don't come out and say, we want to take over the government and the people don't need to have any say, and you're not going to be able to ever say anything against me anymore, and I'm going to rig that. No one ever comes out and says that. We're going to make it socialist, so you're all going to be hungry, and a quarter of the population is going to. No. So they're very. What I think is one of the most dangerous things that was, I guess, talked about in 1984. And Ayn Rand talked about in Atlas Shrugged is just the way that people can be overtaken by political dogma. So what did Chavez say that convinced the people?
Yeah, well, there's an article from the New York Times that was published the day after Hugo Chavez won his first election. That was December 11, 1998. He would assume power then in February of the following year. And the New York Times interviewed two people, one that voted for Chavez and one that voted against him. And the quote of the woman they interviewed that voted for Chavez said, "We don't want a dictatorship, we just want change." Well, they did get change, but they also got a dictatorship. Funnily enough, the man they quoted who voted against him was completely right of exactly what happened. He said he's going to turn us into a communist country and we're all going to have to leave. And that's exactly what occurred. To this day, I think, where are those two people 24 years later, right? And that's the sad part, right? Nobody is what you're saying. Nobody comes into power when they took over a country democratically and says, I'm going to be a dictator. That's the opposite of what they say. They actually try to tell you everything's going to be okay. You know, Chavez, when he was running for office, he would say, I'm a Democrat. He would even say, I am not a communist. I am not a Marxist. Even though everybody who was actually paying attention knew he was a friend of Fidel Castro. He wanted to redistribute land. He wanted to take over private property. He just didn't want to be labeled that because it was a negative label. And he said, I will respect freedom of the media. I will never take over, a media company or a TV station. And he took over every TV station and radio stations. With the very few private that are left were bought by his comrades. So he took over all the media. So it was a complete lie. And so the question I guess this brings up is, if they're all lying, then how do you identify it? Right? And why did this happen in the first place? What conditions led to the people voting for somebody whose clear intention, obviously he said he was not going to be a dictator, but his clear intention was to be, the elites, the rich people are oppressing the poor people, and the rich are rich because the poor are poor, and we need to take away from them. We need to distribute the oil money well. I am going to, do right by you and make the poor, the rich poorer. As a revenge. How we identify this is, first, this happened in Venezuela because even though Venezuela was a free country, even though Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America, Venezuela had a stagnant economy for about 10 years before Chavez got elected. We were still the richest in Latin America because we were the richest by far. So no countries didn't catch up with us. We had a neighbor like Colombia that was war-ridden because of terrorism and civil war. And we actually had millions of Colombians who went to Venezuela. But Venezuela had stagnated because of increasing government intervention in the economy since the late 70s. We were in the late 50s, the fourth richest country in the world by GDP per capita, gross domestic product per person. From that, we fell gradually and then stagnated from the late 70s, then in the 80s worse, and then worse off in the 90s. We had a chance in the late 90s where we had some free market reforms that privatized some of the things that were taken over, allowed private investment in more sectors, deregulated, lower taxes. But that was too late. And it was too late. The economy was already not doing well. And that's when Chavez got elected and reversed all those reforms and put us into what true socialism is, right? Take over private property of your land, of people's businesses. He would walk around the cities and point at people's stores and say, expropiase, which means to take over, the government would come into your business, the military would come with guns and tell you, give them to me. If you don't voluntarily surrender your property, then they'll put you in prison. And that's what he did. Obviously, that destroyed our country. And I think you identify this by first some basic facts. Chavez had attempted a coup in 1992. He went to jail. He was part of the military and then became a civilian, but he had tried to overthrow a democratic government. He killed people. So why would you ever vote for somebody who was a murderer? That's what I think. Regardless of your ideology, you should never justify putting in power somebody with that, history. That should be just the ethical thing to do. But even if they didn't kill somebody, you should never vote for somebody who is trying to pit people against one another and believes these really socialist ideas that the rich are rich because the poor are poor and everything can be solved by putting me in power. That's the problem. And people believed him People were very ignorant, and now everybody else is paying dearly for their choice.
Yeah, right. So very quickly, because I want to toss it to Tova, the Constitution that was able to be so easily converted to give him all those powers. Can you walk through that again about how he did that? And I guess, did people try to revolt against all this? And was it just because and there became sort of a more of the, as you're talking about, the communist tools where you were just picked up and thrown into prison if you tried to do so? And I take it, was there gun control in that country? Were anybody allowed to own guns, the people, when this was happening? And then make it, kind of a quick answer so I can toss it to Tova earlier.
Yeah. Well, this was a gradual process. Venezuela is not North Korea. You know, not everything, even if you say something against the government, that doesn't mean you will go to prison or anything will happen. It matters more if you're actually a perceived threat by the regime. And maybe if you protest in the street, but if you're not a perceived threat, or if you don't anger anybody specifically with power, then nothing will happen to you. But, it can also happen to you that you make a funny tweet mocking a specific member of the regime, they see it, and then you disappear from the face of the earth. That happens a lot. But it's not the most common outcome. What did happen, as from the beginning, there were protests against Chavez. As soon as he started abusing power, there began to be protests. In 2002, there was a huge strike of the oil industry in the whole country. People marched towards the presidential palace, and he was actually overthrown by the military for a day. The military, which was still not taken over by him. And unfortunately, that coup failed, and he came back to power. The day after he came back, he fired everybody who was part of the strike. He completely cleansed the military and began indoctrinating them with Cuban trainers that came from Fidel Castro. And eventually, when we tried to have a referendum in 2004, where people collected signatures, a recall referendum, which was part of his new constitution. And what his Minister of Communications did is that he published on his own website a list of everybody who signed against Chavez, so violating the secrecy of the vote and of elections, and which put fear into people, saying, oh, so they know who you vote for. And then not only did they publish it online just to expose people, but they actually banned everybody in that list from government benefits and public jobs. So it was very consequential. It was well over 1 million people in a country of about 30 million now. So that's how it gradually began. Eventually turned more authoritarian to the point where they killed protesters in the streets, to the point where they tortured people they took over, especially young teenagers. They even bragged about it and posted it on YouTube, I think as part of a fear strategy, so that you don't even go in the first place. They started sending gang members and criminals in motorcycles to take people in protests. And so, yes, there's been so many protests. Venezuelans have tried to overthrow them for so long. But as you say, Venezuelans don't have guns. Venezuelans never had a Second Amendment. And so what are they going to do? You can't fight if they control the AK-47s and you have, sticks and wood, because that's the situation.
Very interesting. Thank you for all of this. And I just gonna make a comment, and then I'll toss is that in the do y'all consider, is Venezuela considered communist now or socialist? What is it considered?
I think that the real term is socialism. Communism is the phase, according to Marx, after socialism, where there's no government and everybody shares. There are things that's never going to happen. It's always socialism, where the government owns the means of production. So yeah, North Korea is socialist, China to some degree, certainly Cuba, Venezuela.
Okay. And it's just interesting to me that they would let people leave, because, in the days of communism, Russia and China, you couldn't leave if you wanted to leave. You had to escape. So, and half the people left. Okay, fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to toss it to Tova. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and sharing this great overview. I wanted to ask more a bit about like your personal story. So, when did you come over to the US from Venezuela, and what was it like encountering American culture and American government coming from Venezuela?
Yeah, well, I came to the US in 2016. It was not my first time in the United States. I had come before with my parents in tourism, before the economy really went downhill. And so I knew what America was like. I didn't know specifically where I went to. It was my first time going to Indiana, which is where I went to college. The reason, how I got here was because I knew that I wanted to study abroad. The question was, how do I get out of Venezuela? I applied to colleges here. I ended up getting a full ride scholarship to study in Indiana. And that's how I ended in Indiana. Everybody asks me all the time, how did a Venezuelan end up in Indiana? And, I got a full ride scholarship to go there. So that's where I went. And it was a wonderful experience. And I loved Indiana. And, I go back every now and then because I miss it. And so, that's how I came encountering it. I knew about America, since I was a younger kid, because when I was 12 years old in my school library, I picked up a book called Free to Choose by Milton Friedman, which I highly recommend to everybody here. And it's a book about the importance of free enterprise and the problems with government intervention. And he described many things in the United States when with government regulations. He described many things with the USSR and Eastern Europe back then. This is a book, I think, from 1976. And so then I watched YouTube videos about him and all of these things. I watched videos of Reagan. I got into, what's going on in America today in American politics. And so I was very involved since I was young. And that's how I fell in love eventually with the United States.
Yeah, and I'm sure Indiana was an interesting transition. I'm from Illinois, so right nearby. But I was curious, so now as you advocate for freedom in Venezuela, what specific challenges or issues do you think need to be addressed, or do you think it's more just a general like regime change and change in government? Like what's your vision for kind of the future of freedom in Venezuela and what you think needs to be done to achieve that goal?
Yeah, well, one important thing, I think a big problem right now is that we have really naive and cynical governments around the world that are not really interested in helping the Venezuelan people at all, including here in the United States. We have an administration that has actually lifted sanctions on Venezuela that allows the Venezuelan regime that owns the oil to export oil to other nations and receive those profits. And people, it's not just the Venezuelan economy has been destroyed, but they've stolen hundreds of billions of dollars and become some of the richest people in the world. The problem is that obviously it's not official or measured, right? You can't compare them to Bill Gates or anything like that because it's illegal wealth. But some of the richest people in the world are Venezuelan regime officials. Their children live the great lives in Europe and in other countries, studying abroad, making money, all with the effort of what they stole, the effort they stole from the Venezuelan people. And so it's a profound injustice that other countries are allowing this. Regardless of whether you support, or how do you want to support Venezuelan freedom, you should not allow these criminals to enjoy the products of their crime abroad in your country, if you believe you're a free country. And so I think that that's one of the things that I'm advocating the most. We need other countries to get tougher on this, to get tougher on these individuals, to get tougher on the sanctions against the government specifically. And, I think that's how we start. But other than that, it's very difficult to do change internally because of what I said, right? A quarter of the population has left because they have no hope. I understand they have no hope because Cuba, the country that Venezuela is following, has been going on for about 70 years now. And they can't keep going. And they can't transition after the leader dies. The Venezuelan leader already died. Hugo Chavez died. He gave the power to Maduro. I think that if there is an internal change now in Venezuela, it will not be for freedom. It will be just to replace Maduro with somebody else of their own team. And the reason is that how will there ever be freedom when the Venezuelan military now, which is completely taken over by them, it's not a separate institution, it's part of the regime. They profit from, say, the grocery stores that they took over. They profit from the drug trade. They're part of a cartel indicted by the Department of Justice called the Cartel of the Suns. And so in no democracy, in no future democratic Venezuela, no matter its political leaning, does the population, the voters, allow its military to be drug dealers. That's never going to happen, and they know it's never going to happen. Therefore, they will never allow democracy to happen in the first place. And that's the equation we need to change. And I'm not exactly sure how, but it definitely has to be from abroad.
I see. Thank you. And then, we've had this series on different kind of governments throughout the world. We did like North Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and a lot of our other speakers expressed hope with technology and social media, and that being a sort of way to expose people within the country to ideas or maybe encourage change. What do you see as the role of technology or social media or these new tools? Do you see a role for them to maybe educate people or cause change, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, the big difference between, say, Cuba and Venezuela is that socialism came later to Venezuela than to Cuba. And so as a consequence, in Venezuela, there are smartphones, there are phones with internet, people have computers, not everybody for sure, but everybody has access to information from abroad in one way or another, directly or indirectly. And so, that's certainly something to be hopeful for, say, maybe North Koreans, if they smuggle things inside, or Cubans that are getting some access now for the first time. But Venezuelans have always had access. That's how we organize protests. It's nothing new, unfortunately. I think, I'm very honest with how I speak, and I'm not hopeful. I think that the Venezuelan regime is going to stay here for decades more. And I wish that it will end in my lifetime. So I'm able to go back, visit, and see what it's like, even if it's destroyed, just to visit people I know, if anybody's left. But I'm personally not very hopeful. And I think most Venezuelans are not hopeful, unfortunately, and that's why they leave, right? If you talk with somebody inside now, they are only in two moods. One is, I'm just, hanging in there, struggling to live paycheck to paycheck. And the other people is, I'm struggling to live paycheck to paycheck, but I'm saving to go out. And that's the mood.
Yeah, I see. When you said that a fourth of the country had left, I mean, those are massive numbers, especially what you were talking about with how wealthy the country was just, recently. But I was curious if you could talk a bit about,
especially our generations, people our age. Of my high school class, half of them are out of the country. It's not a quarter. Most of the people who left are the young people. So people who are staying are just the older generation. And that's, what you see older folks living by themselves in small apartments. The rest of the house is empty and abandoned. It's a sad picture.
Wow. Yeah. No, thank you for that addition. And then could you talk a bit about the broader history of Venezuela, and how you think that might have affected how things ended up turning out, especially with, the history of colonization, or with how the economy is run, or just like, I guess, taking a longer look at the history of the country?
Yeah. Well, it's not a lie that the Spanish colonies in the Americas were and have worse economic outcomes than the English colonies. I think worldwide, really. It's part, I think, of how the colonization process worked, right? The colonization process of the British was driven mainly by private enterprise that came to colonize independently, was people fleeing religious freedom. The colonization process of the Spanish colonies and the Portuguese colonies was government driven. It was actually a government commission that went there, did everything government made. Sure, the church had a big role, but it was still driven by the crown. And so I think it all began with that. But obviously Venezuela has a wildly different outcome than, say, Chile. Chile is the richest country in Latin America today. We actually switched places. In the 70s, Chile was in the worst place and Venezuela in the best. Now we're the total opposite. And why? Because countries that become prosperous because they are free. Freedom leads to prosperity. And while Venezuela became ever less free, in 1970, we were the 10th freest economy in the world, according to the Fraser Institute. Today, we're the second to last. Chile was one of the least free countries in the world in the 1970s. Today, it has a freer economy than the United States. And so, and you see, and that's how Chile has become so successful in such a short time span, right? Because, you know, don't forget, obviously they're not like America, but, you know, we have 200 years advantage to them in being a free country, right? I mean, obviously they haven't yet caught up, but they've caught up to a tremendous degree. To maybe in less than 50 years, they'll be just as rich as we are. And so what we need to understand about the history of the world is that free countries become prosperous. The question is always how to keep that freedom. And with freedom, I don't just mean free press and freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I mean freedom of enterprise. There are many countries that don't have political freedoms that are rich. And obviously you don't just want to be rich, you want to have many social freedoms too. But a lot of people blame what happened in Venezuela on this historical context on it being a resource-rich nation and having oil. And they point out to a phenomenon in economics that is called the resource curse, where countries that actually have more resources, even though they should be richer, they end up poorer because they mismanage them. But that's not true. I think this is an overused explanation that doesn't actually explain much at all. I mean, you see it in the world. Where are the resource-rich countries? Saudi Arabia, extremely rich. Iran, much better off than Venezuela, even though they have a tyrannical government too. You know, the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, everybody dreams of going to Dubai. And so when oil prices go down, you don't see people starving in the Arabian desert. You did see people starving in Venezuela. What's different? At least we can grow food in Venezuela. You can't grow food in the middle of the desert. So clearly, the resources are not what makes countries rich, nor what breaks them. It's the freedom, it's the political freedoms. And I am not a determinist. I do not believe that our future is predetermined by the conditions of your country or the resources of things you don't control. I do think we make our own destiny, and it is about the choices of the population.
Well, yeah, thank you for that explanation. I'll now pass on to Jewel and Jordan, but I appreciate you being here and for your time.
Nice to talk to you again, Daniel. You're educating us and our audience greatly. First question, it was striking as you described Venezuela, almost scary, that a lot of that sounded like California. So one thing I wanted to mention was, why do we see a link between crime and socialism? What do you think that link is? Because it's not intuitive. It's not something we may guess, but we see lawlessness also go with more socialist policies. And I wonder if you can see if there's any reason for that, or think that thought on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure really if there is a link. And I'll tell you why. Venezuela is really the first of these socialist nations throughout the 20th century and the 21st that has a crime problem. Crime was not such a big problem in the Soviet Union. It is not in Cuba. It was not in Eastern Europe. It is only in Venezuela. And that's a new thing that makes our type of socialism much worse, right? Because where I lived in Caracas, one of the cities with the highest murder rate in the world, we didn't just have high homicide rates. We had kidnappings everywhere. We had robberies by the day. There were people that got robbed several times a day, and it was just a running joke. Well, like, they robbed you again today. What are you doing, man? You know, and we just laughed about it. People went out without phones. And it's funny, that's why Venezuelans have a lot of dark humor, because we laugh about these tragedies. But it is a new thing. I think in the United States, and you mentioned California, you mentioned socialism and crime. Let me give you an example here. The DA, the district attorney of San Francisco from 2020 to 2022, he was recalled because even the San Franciscans didn't want him. His name was Chesa Boudin. Chesa Boudin was not just any politician who got elected DA. The DA is the person that charges people who get arrested for crimes. Okay, so if you rob, if you kill somebody, etc. He actually worked for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He was his translator for several years. He even wrote 2 books about his experience in Venezuela. So of course, We have a current problem in the United States when we are hiring as the chief law enforcement officers of one of the most important cities in this country, somebody who's learning from Venezuela, somebody who worked for a tyrant. And so, yes, I am very concerned about that. I think it's part of the trend of exporting the Venezuelan socialist model, exporting to the United States. And I'm very concerned that, they're justifying it here based on racial reasons, when the people that they most hurt are actually the people they claim to want to protect.
Wow, that's a pretty interesting piece of information you gave there. I don't think anyone realized that that we have DAs that actually studied in the Venezuelan regime. I wanted to ask quickly, is the current election that happened in Venezuela and was in the news a lot, it's hard from your description of everything, you're giving a really good picture of helping us understand how a country can fall into socialism and how you can get stuck there when you give away constitutional rights and you don't have a freedom bolstered by a law that the government can't violate in some way. At the same time, I don't think many of us really understand what just happened in Venezuela, and it was on the news like every day for 2 weeks probably, and then it was off the news because that's how our news works. But was there like a more freedom side and a socialist side, or was it really just two bad sides? And could you tell us from a Venezuelan perspective?
Yeah, you mean in the most recent happenings, or just in the past?
Just in the most recent elections.
Yeah, okay. Well, first, all elections have been rigged in Venezuela for many years now, for well over a decade. And what I mean rigged, I mean like now Venezuelans don't trust the election at all, and they don't trust it so much that what we do is that we simply don't vote. And so the streets are empty on election day on purpose. And then the regime says 20 million people voted, which is a complete lie because nobody was in line in the voting booths, and they just make up the numbers. They didn't used to make up the numbers. They used to try to mask them, that people voting, intimidation, offering bribes to voters on election day, things like that. They would even come to the shanty towns and bring fridges and microwaves to give away if you voted for them. They would control all the media, propaganda, and that's how it began. So it was kind of like unfair elections before. Now it's just rigged elections. And so what happened most recently with Guaido and the news in 2019, what happened was that the opposition that had the majority in the National Assembly, the regime let them have the majority, even though they stripped them of all the power. So we had a majority in an assembly that couldn't pass any laws. It was just, a show. And that allowed the regime to say, look, we have democracy, the opposition won, even though they can't actually change anything. And so what they did is that there was a presidential election in 2018, which they rigged again. And the opposition tried to follow the regime's own constitution in saying, because this was rigged, therefore the president of the parliament is now the president until there are new elections. And that's how Guaido got there in the news. The guy that everybody saw. The problem is that, sure, you do that, but what do you do next? The regime says they don't recognize you, even if the rest of the world recognizes you, which they do, at least the Western countries. What do you do about it? What are you going to do to the regime? They have the guns, you don't. You can complain, you can protest, you can have events. They don't really care. They're going to keep making money, and they're going to keep having the power over the country. The military is not going to revolt against them because they are the military. And so that's the impasse where we're at. Now, you said, are there two bad sides? I'll say this, I don't trust the opposition either. And I don't trust the opposition because this regime is extremely intelligent, unfortunately. You don't become a dictator by being dumb, okay? You have to actually be very smart, just evil, in addition to that. And what happened is that, I'll give you an example. After Chavez rewrote the constitution, there was a new general election in the year 2000 for all positions in government, from local to presidency. And there was one candidate of the opposition against him, and all the parties united against Chavez. This man is named Francisco Arias Cárdenas. Francisco said everything you can imagine in the campaign trail against Chavez. You're a murderer, you're a thief, all of which are true to Chavez. And after he lost the election, legitimately, by the way, he switched and became a governor of the Socialist United Party of Venezuela. So what can I think as a Venezuelan citizen after that? He was their plan B. Even if they lose, they win. They have everybody bought off. And so they bought off a significant portion of the opposition. The Venezuelan people are psychotic because they don't know who to trust. And that's the truth. I don't know who to trust in Venezuela.
Wow. I think it was
that's something. You had mentioned how so many people are leaving and that it's people your age. Now, can you foresee that pretty soon there's not going to be enough citizens to really keep the country going? Like, what do you think what is it going to be like? What's population in, 10, 20 years from now, if nothing else changes?
Yeah, immigration. And this is where, one of the, Janine said something like this. The curious thing about this socialist regime is that they let people leave. And I think it's actually smart, right? Because what's happened is that not allowing people to leave is, I think, part of the reason the Eastern European socialist regimes fell apart. There was just too much pressure. In Venezuela, allowing people to leave is first an escape valve, because the people more likely to leave are the people more likely to oppose the regime. Two, it's an economic relief valve, right? Venezuela is not producing anything. The economy has shrunk by about 85% in a matter of a few years. The Great Depression, that people were starving in the United States in the 1920s and 30s, was about a 20% GDP reduction. This is worse than 4 times over the Great Depression. That is what's happening in Venezuela today. And, it's a country where we had electricity first than any other South American country. And now there are days where the whole country doesn't have electricity for several days. I had days in my apartment where we didn't have water for several weeks. Running water, no running water. Going from a lifestyle like in a US middle-class family to not having running water or electricity, that's what happened. Or my family's income went from, $3,000-$4,000 a month in the early 2000s to $100 a month in 2016. That's what happened with our economy. Mm-hmm. And what happens with immigration is that now you have a quarter of the population outside sending remittances into the country. That's why Venezuelans are not starving to death. Otherwise, more people would have left and more people would have died. But what happened is that with all of us outside sending money in, it stabilized the situation for the poorest Venezuelans. So they're not starving, which is good. But it also means that, things can just stay like this perpetually. I think immigration is eventually going to stabilize because as, young people leave, there's fewer fertile women to have children. So the population is just going to decline because there's nobody to have babies. And the few people who are going to stay, we're just going to stabilize at a much lower population level. And all the people who live there are going to effectively be parasites of the diaspora abroad.
Do you think that Venezuela is the best place for us to look to study what we don't want to happen here with the most, or do you think that there's a different oppressive regime in the past, possibly one of those Eastern European or Asian countries? Where do you think if you were going to have Americans research and understand one regime so that they would not make those mistakes, which would it be?
I'll tell you this, if socialism ever comes to America, it will come by boats, not by bullets. And so I don't think that we're ever going to be invaded by a much bigger country than us and turn socialist. I don't think America is going to suffer that. I don't think there's going to be a civil war or a violent revolution or a military coup in the United States. I think that if something authoritarian ever rises to power here, will be because Americans voted for those people. And so that's why the best regime to study is really the Venezuelan regime. Sure, you can study like the Nazis or the Italian fascists, which also were voted in initially. But it's a very different nature. It's much farther into the past. It's driven by, anti-Semitism, which is, I don't think would be what would drive a future authoritarian US government. I think the big problem would be populism, socialism, and that's what drove Venezuela into disaster. So that's why I think Venezuela is a great example to study.
Thank you so much for all of your questions, your wealth of knowledge, and you're excellent at sharing your experiences in such a fast way, especially on a forum like this for the podcast. And I think people of every age probably understood what you've said so far. I think we got some audience questions we've got to get to.
Yes, thank you, Jill and Jorn, for your questions, and Tova and Janine. We do have some great audience questions. And first, we want to give a shout out to the students who are watching today. We have Lizette Flores, Ann Walsh, Cher Stiegel, and Mari Wright, all with groups of homeschool students watching. So we appreciate you all participating, and we especially encourage the students to type questions into our Q&A. We also want to recognize Kristen Tokarov, who's one of our We the Future contest winners, has been on in our audience today, and Lawrence Barclay, who has won our senior citizen essay one year. So we want to give our We the Future contest winners a shout out as well. And we want to thank our listeners of KKVV in Las Vegas, 1060 on the AM dial, airs Monday nights, 6 p.m. KKVV airs our chats every Monday night, 6 p.m. in Las Vegas. So thank you. So Daniel, Robert Spiegler asks, are things better or worse since you spoke with us last year on our constitutional chats?
I will say things are slightly better in Venezuela because the government has allowed the effective dollarization of the economy and lifted price controls. So there are no more shortages in Venezuela. And because people receive remittances from abroad, those who do receive remittances can, feed themselves, which, they can't have electricity and water all day and security, but they can feed themselves and be more reliable. So I would say things are slightly better, maybe 10% better.
Okay, well, thank you. And then Jill Cullis asks, what difference do you see with what is going on in Colombia and the history of Venezuela? And she expands on that a little bit. So many went to Colombia. When they left Venezuela, they took the largest number of people, and now they're dealing with the influx of these individuals.
Yeah.
She goes on to say Maduro opened the prisons and allowed them to leave to Colombia.
Okay, so let me address this in two parts. First, I am extremely concerned about Colombia because they elected somebody who actually was a mentor to Hugo Chavez, their current president, Gustavo Petro, which, by the way, if you start following what's happening right now, I'm talking about the last few days in Colombia, the campaign manager of Petro, the current president, currently leaked a bunch of audios that he sent to people, and he's threatened to reveal all the illegal financing that he got from Venezuela to get elected in Colombia, which I have no doubt that he did, because this is definitely a strategy in South America, and it's driven by an organization called the Forum of Sao Paulo, which is the political international organization where all these socialist leaders, first founded by Cuba and Venezuela, meet to try to promote them winning elections abroad. And so that's what they do. And then second, you mentioned about them dealing with the migrants. Yes, they're the country with the most Venezuelan migrants, about 2.5 million of 7.5 million in the world. And but you mentioned about them opening the prisons. I think this is something that's been going on the news, but nobody actually has a real source on this. I am very skeptical simply because people just don't go to prison in Venezuela for crimes. So there's really not many people to release from prison in Venezuela. Certainly not millions, maybe a couple thousand. So I don't think that that's an important factor.
Okay. And you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more, because Sandy Thatcher asks, many Latin American countries went through authoritarian regimes, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, but returned to becoming democracies again, though Brazil recently experienced a threat to become authoritarian again. So why cannot Venezuela change also? And what would it take for such a reversion to democracy to come about?
Yeah, John Kirkpatrick, former UN ambassador, former US UN ambassador to the United Nations, I think she defined it really well. These dictatorships that these countries you mentioned had were not socialist dictatorships. They were military dictatorships. They had a very different set of incentives. They were not embedded with drug trafficking. They were not embedded with international criminal organizations, with the USSR, with Cuba, with other regimes. So it's very different. In Chile, they voluntarily gave up power. That's never going to happen in Venezuela. And you mentioned Brazil experiencing a threat of authoritarianism. I very much disagree with you on that. I don't think Bolsonaro was a dictator at all. I mean, he gave up power. He didn't even challenge legally the election or anything. He's back in Brazil. If anything, the current president of Brazil, who won and beat Bolsonaro, who is a friend of Maduro and says in Venezuela there's no dictatorship, that's the real threat in Brazil. And so that's what's different in Venezuela. In Venezuela, the difference is the nature of the tyranny is much stronger.
Well, thank you. And finally, Greg Johnson makes a comment, and I guess as he's hearing you describe what has gone on in Venezuela, he says, this sounds like the current path of America. Could you react to that and talk about where you see our country going and how you think we will survive differently than the outcome of Venezuela?
Yeah, well, we have a very different history. We're a very different country. So, I hope, and I don't think, one of the reasons I love America and I chose to come to America was because I think this is the country with the least likelihood of going through what Venezuela went through, okay? So that's part of the hopeful part. We have a Second Amendment. We have a constitution that's much more powerful. And not only do we have a Second Amendment, but we have a population that exercises its rights. Right? We have a well-armed population. And that might seem like, oh, Janelle, you're just saying because of the guns. No, I mean, the Second Amendment was put in the Constitution, not because of crime or because of hunting. It was put in to, eventually fight a tyrannical government if that ever came to happen. And so I think it's a good preventive mechanism to something really bad happening very quickly. The thing we need to be concerned about is not something really bad happening very quickly, it's something really bad happening very gradually, right? Venezuela did not become a socialist country from one day to the next. It was not even on Chavez's first day in office. It took many years. And you can actually boil a frog without it jumping by slowly heating it up in water. And that's the problem with us. And I think we have a generation of Americans, young Americans, that are not being taught correctly about the values of America and why we are prosperous and what freedom actually means. Freedom doesn't mean that the government gives you free things. Freedom means that the government leaves you alone to do what you wish to do without hurting others. And so that's what we need to be focusing on. And it's so sad to me to see how Americans are getting stuck in these conversations about, that are trying to divide them up by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, by, everything you can imagine. And they're trying to divide and conquer. In Venezuela, it was rich against poor. That doesn't work as well here because the truth is that most Americans who are lower income, they want to be rich and there's a lot more upward mobility here. And so they're trying to divide us in other directions, and we can't let that happen. We can't, because if we do, and if we forget that we are prosperous because of our freedoms, we're going to very easily give up our freedoms. My challenge, and I guess my closing to everybody here today, is when you open the faucet in your sink, when you turn on the light in your apartment, you have to understand that that's a miracle. That's something that you didn't build. That's something that was built thanks to the freedoms that previous generations had. And that is very hard to create and very easy to take away. And so be thankful for those things, because if you are thankful for what you have today, you are much more likely to protect it and to be careful about playing with politics in those regards.
Well, thank you. And we are thankful for you and being on our show today and your great message that you share and all the time that you take to help educate your generation. And Janine, would you like to make any closing comments?
Oh, Daniel, I'll just say that was terrific. And I loved your quote about freedom that you just said, and how we should value America and learn about what freedom really means, and thinking about the water and electricity and the people that created it because they had the freedom to do so. And then it's easier to, it's harder to make it, and it's easy to lose it. So thank you so much for your wisdom today. I appreciate you very much. Thank you.
If you want to follow what I do, you can look me up on social media. I am on Twitter at Daniel DivMartino, just my first name and last name. You can also look up the project that I have. It's called the Dissident Project. That's dissidentproject.org. We're a nonprofit organization that sends immigrants like me who escaped from authoritarian countries to speak at high schools at no cost. You can also book us for other events and we can arrange something, but our main target is high schools and middle schools. And I think the Constituting America team also has an online resource that they'll share with you that I have.
Well, thank you. And I was just putting your link in to share it with our audience members. So we really appreciate your time and look forward to having you back one of these days. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we remind our audience that next week we're going to be talking about China, and we'll be having an author who escaped from China and has a really interesting story to tell. So we hope y'all join us next Tuesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all.